Voy a iniciar el seminario y mi nombre es Eduardo Gamarra, para los que no están acá y los que no me conocen. Soy profesor de política en la Universidad Internacional de la Florida, donde también me desempeño como director asociado de investigación básica en el Gordon Institute. Y además en el mismo Gordon Institute codirijo el programa que se llama el Foro de Opinión Pública Latina. Es un placer para mí darles a todos la bienvenida a este seminario que se llama Venezuela at a Crossroads, Reassessing Sanctions. What is the best way forward? Este seminario es copatrocinado por el Instituto Jack Gordon y por el Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. Este es parte de una serie de seminarios sobre el tema venezolano y en particular sobre el tema de sanciones y relaciones entre Estados Unidos y Venezuela, que realizaremos en el curso de los próximos 2 meses. La próxima sesión será el 20 de noviembre para ver qué le espera al próximo presidente de los Estados Unidos en cuanto lo que tenga que ver con Venezuela. Y en la segunda semana de diciembre, si no me equivoco, probablemente me voy a equivocar, pero creo que es el 12 de diciembre, tendremos el tercer seminario donde contemplaremos un poco qué le espera, ¿no?, a Venezuela en el 2025. Entonces, muy bienvenidos y ahora paso a presentar a nuestra moderadora, la doctora Gabriela Oberman, directora de programas académicos en el Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU. Les digo que esto va a ser una presentación bilingüe. Los que prefieran hablar en inglés lo pueden hacer y los que prefieran hablar en español lo pueden hacer también. Pero for all purposes, this is a bilingual session. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Hoberman.
Thank you, Eduardo, so much, and thank you, Brian, as well, for the invitation. I am delighted to be the moderator for this webinar on Venezuela at a Crossroads, and it is my pleasure to introduce the wonderful lineup of speakers that we have for today. We have Asdrúbal Oliveros, who is a partner and director of Ecoanalítica, an economic and financial advisory company based in Caracas. For 5 years, he was a senior economist at Santander Investment and has worked as a consultant for multilateral organizations and a professor at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello and Universidad Central de Venezuela. Next, we have Dr. Christopher Sabatini. He is a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House and was formerly a lecturer in discipline in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Chris is also on the advisory boards at Harvard University, Las Paul, the Advisory Committee for Human Rights Watch American Division, and the Inter-American Foundation. He's also an HFX Fellow at the Halifax International Security Forum. Thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Asdrúbal. We also have Brian Fonseca, who is the director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and also an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Brian's technical expertise is on U.S. national security and foreign policy. Brian holds degrees in international business and international relations from Florida International University in Miami, Florida, and he has attended Sichuan University in Chengdu, China, and National Defense University in Washington, D.C. From 1997 to 2004, he served in the U.S. Marine Corps and facilitated the training of foreign military forces in both hostile theaters and during peacetime operations. And we have Feliciano Reyna. Mr. Reyna founded CODEVIDA, the coalition of Venezuelan organizations for the rights to health and to life of those affected by chronic health conditions. He also serves on a number of boards of international NGOs such as Civicus, working closely with UN human rights mechanisms since 2006. Feliciano Reyna was instrumental in establishing the independent international fact-finding mission on Venezuela to assess alleged human rights violations committed in the country since 2014. So again, it's a pleasure to have you all joining this webinar. And roughly we'll have an hour and 25 minutes for our roundtable discussions. And I would suggest for the responses to be no more than 3 minutes, so we make sure we can accommodate all the questions and also include questions from the audience and all attendees. So I'd like to start with the first question, talking about the general context on the impact of sanctions. And I'd like to ask all of you, if you can provide us with an overview of the impact that past US and international sanctions had had on Venezuela's economy and political landscape. So that's my general questions. Feel free to take the first question as we start this seminar. Thank you. Christopher?
I'll jump in. Thank you, Gabriela. So, and thanks to FIU for this opportunity. I have a diversified opinion when it comes to sanctions, but I'm going to come to the issue of Venezuelan sanctions. I think, first of all, we should not conflate the completely dysfunctional policies that the first Chavez and Maduro administration implemented with the effect of sanctions. The government of Chavez and Maduro implemented a series of measures that completely collapsed the economy, that led to the concentration of economic control over a narrow segment of, to put it lightly, oligarchs, corrupt oligarchs, but then also led to the complete breakdown of fiscal responsibility in the Venezuelan government. Having said that, though, we can track the outflow of migrants from Venezuela, which 20%, a horrible, and Feliciano will talk about this, I'm sure, a horrible impact for citizens of Venezuela, for the region generally, on just humanity. And that, in part, does flow from the sanctions regime. Now, here's the issue, and I've maintained this, and I'm writing a paper right now on sanctions generally on Latin America, is that we need to separate what could be well-intentioned sanctions from their unintended consequences. And I do think often we do not, the United States in this case, although there are other countries that often are involved in sanctions, we do not take into account the unintended consequences of sanctions, whether it's outmigration, humanitarian collapse, general suffering. And I think in this case, sanctions, in the case of Venezuela, which are intended to provoke an immediate regime change. Just by way of backtracking, in 2019, the Trump administration implemented what it called the maximum pressure sanctions in support of the Juan Guaido fictional government. The idea was soon the Maduro government would collapse. It did not. Those sanctions remained in place. And over time, those basically prolonged the suffering of Venezuelan citizens without producing the desired effect. And as a semi-academic, and what, I'm sorry, that was my cat. Sorry. It's a black cat, it's Halloween, very fitting. But you know, the intended policy hypothesis of sanctions is that they will provoke citizens to rise up to overturn a regime. That did not happen in Venezuela. And the risk always with sanctions is they become in place, that they become frozen in time. And so while we can discuss the merit of sanctions, the merit of lifting them, there is a really genuine risk about the stasis around sanctions that I think we saw in Venezuela. And again, I do not intend to conflate the effect of sanctions with the very misguided, dysfunctional, cruel at times, and corrupt policies of the Chavez and Maduro administration. I'll end there.
Gabriela,
Thank you. Thank you, please.
May I jump in? No,
of course, Brian.
Thank you. No, first and foremost, I agree with Chris entirely. I think it's important to disaggregate the instruments that U.S. uses to put pressure on the regime from what we know is to be an incredibly corrupt, dictatorship residing in Miraflores. But I think to answer let me ask a different question, or give you a simple answer, and that is the sanctions. What they have not done is provoke regime change, right? I mean, the whole intent of sanctions, and by measure of success, was to provoke or create the conditions for some form of regime change. That has not happened, period, right? Now, some of the things that the sanctions have done, which completely undermine American policy, American foreign policy, is certainly exacerbate the humanitarian conditions on the ground, number one, dissuade Western investment, including U.S. companies, from operating in Venezuela, which leaves zero footprint for the Americans, right? Three, sort of bring a constellation of nefarious countries, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, others, together and sort of push them to swing or swim in the same direction. And so while the sanctions have clearly not been effective at what they were designed to do, and there's probably several reasons that we can talk through in terms of what has limited sanctions' ability to have teeth in Venezuela. But in addition to sort of that failure from a policy perspective or a policy outcome, it's exacerbated the humanitarian crisis. It's dissuaded Western investment, sort of moved American businesses that had historically strong footprints on the ground in Venezuela. We've lost that. So we have virtually no influence on the ground. And it's pushed Venezuela closer to Russia and China, which all are strategic competitors in the broader global geopolitical landscape, notwithstanding other things, just like fracturing sort of the geopolitical, discourse in Latin America in general. So I'll stop there, but I think, again, just to reinforce, it's not worked, and it's caused some serious impediments to U.S. interests in I think the mid and long term. To recover some of that stuff is going to take incredible time and treasure.
I would just like to second Brian's very good intervention. So I agree, Brian. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. Great points there. Asdrúbal and Feliciano, we'd like to hear from you.
Sí, bueno, buenas tardes. Me gustaría destacar algunas cosas sobre el tema sanciones, en línea un poco con mis predecesores, tanto Christopher O'Brien, sobre este tema. Efectivamente, a veces cuando asumimos el tema de las sanciones, pensamos que el gobierno no va a actuar, se va a quedar de alguna manera estático sufriendo los efectos. Y la verdad, hemos tenido un gobierno extremadamente dinámico en su respuesta a las sanciones. En primer lugar, el efecto principalmente se traslada a la población y a las empresas, que quienes son los que sufren un poco más los efectos punitivos del aislamiento, del overcompliance y otros elementos, pero también el gobierno lo que ha hecho es generar mecanismos alternativos para enfrentar estas sanciones, y paradójicamente esos mecanismos alternativos lo hacen más fuerte. Voy a poner un ejemplo en este momento. Nosotros estamos exportando cerca de unos 880.000 barriles de petróleo en este momento. Es más o menos el nivel de exportación de Venezuela. De esos están bajo licencias, principalmente las operaciones de Chevron, Rexol y Morel & Pro. Ahí estamos alrededor de 300.000 barriles. Estos barriles se venden principalmente en el mercado de los Estados Unidos. Los ingresos de esos barriles no entran directamente en control del gobierno de Maduro. Una parte va para pagar la deuda con estas empresas, otra parte va para inversión, para que los campos sigan produciendo, y la otra parte va al mercado cambiario para abastecer a empresas venezolanas, sobre todo que compran alimentos y medicinas. No hay un manejo directo por parte del gobierno de esos fondos. Si yo quito esas licencias, un poco para meterle más presión al gobierno, es la lógica, Maduro va a vender ese petróleo en China, principalmente, bajo mecanismos de mercado negro, sin ningún tipo de control, lo vende en efectivo, lo vende a través de múltiples intermediarios. Y es verdad que hay un descuento, pero el ingreso está bajo control de Maduro, bajo los grupos de poder que lo sostienen. Entonces, cuando yo más bien elimino las licencias, pongo más petróleo en control directo de Maduro y de los grupos de poder, que de alguna manera influyen en su sostenimiento. Entonces, por eso es que hay que evaluar muy bien los impactos de estas medidas, porque en muchos casos las sanciones lo que han favorecido es la economía ilícita, es los flujos poco transparentes que alimentan rentas de grupos de poder muy poderosos que sostienen al gobierno venezolano.
Gracias, Asdrúbal. Muy interesante. Y Feliciano, ¿cuál es tu opinión de cómo ha sido el impacto de estas sanciones por parte de Estados Unidos y de otros actores internacionales?
Sure. I'd like to, as we've done a few times, Gabriela, before, is to try to think of the sanctions not as just one, package that you can take or move around, again, as a whole. They have been implemented in different steps. They have different natures. And so you have the individual ones, and then you have the sectorial and the general sanctions and so on, which I guess is mostly what we are referring to at this point. And those had, as I think Chris said at the beginning, the idea of removing the Venezuelan government at the time, and not really, which is something that many of us thought, that the purpose of them was to, facilitate a process of conversations, negotiations, to look for ways out of a political conflict that had been in place for quite a while already. So unfortunately, when the idea was, again, the removal of the government, it's clear also, as Asdrúbal was saying, that it would react, and it had the means to react, and it had the means to stay in power and say, who are you to come and try to remove us from power, using this tool, as it's also called in the human rights arena, the unilateral coercive measures. So that's one issue, and it has had these consequences that have been mentioned here. And unfortunately, this idea of removing the government instead of facilitating a process of conversations and negotiations, it's what, in a way has maintained them as well with a sort of a theory of change as time has gone by, and not as being part of other mechanisms, other means of the international community to effect change, political changes, not say regime change, political changes that would lead to a reinstitutionalization of Venezuela. The impact on people has been enormous, and unfortunately, I'm not sure if this is going to be the case, that instead of what we're talking about here, of a more flexible, more creative sort of way to approach Venezuela's political conflict, sanctions may be brought into legislation. And if we become, a country that has a package of sanctions dependent on, let's say, Congress and so on, then they will be even more static, even much less conducive to a process of changes. So, I'll leave it there. I have a few numbers and figures here of the humanitarian situation. We talked about impact. I'd really like to talk about it, and even with today's numbers in terms of the international investment in the humanitarian sector, how many people have been reached, but I'll leave that for part of the conversation coming. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And Christopher, you have your hand up, so please go ahead.
Just want to say quickly that I agree with Feliciano, as I always do, that we need to disaggregate the types of sanctions. And so there are targeted sanctions, and I'm an advocate for targeted sanctions, although they have their problems. How we unwind them, what is the sort of goal, what is how we basically convey to those individuals what we expect from them. But I think the issue in part here is about economic sanctions and broad economic sanctions that increase the level of suffering. And as both Asdrúbal and Feliciano said, the logic of them is not entirely clear. How you provoke a regime change by imposing more suffering on people and likely consolidating power, economic power and political power in the regime is not entirely clear. And I'll end on this, is like, without economic independence, and we see this with Cuba, there can be no democracy. We know this going all the way back to John Locke. We know this all the way going back to Thomas Hobbes. And I think it's important to recognize what we understand about the philosophy about democracy, not to wax too academic here.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. I'd like to ask a question, Brian, considering your expertise on, democratic governance and the development of the possibilities for democratic reform and the use of sanctions as a political tool. I'd like to ask you if you feel that these sanctions have effectively pressured the Venezuelan government to move forward towards democratic reform, or if there are any alternative measures that may have had a greater or a similar impact on democratic processes.
Thanks, Gabrielle. That's a great question. And in fact, I think they have had considerable pressure, but not in the direction that the United States has been hoping for. It's not been sort of pressuring the regime towards pathways to restore democracy in Venezuela, but it's been pressuring the regime to dig in. It's been pressuring the regime to find allies that will allow them to circumvent the tools that the U.S. is applying to sort of force them down a particular path. And I think that has been the biggest challenge, is that I think the sort of second and third order effects of sanctions have been equally as bad for American foreign policy, because it's forced a country in incredibly close geographic proximity to the United States, not just geographic proximity, but cultural proximity to the United States, further towards, global geopolitical rivals. Russia, I named them earlier, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey. And so I think, again, it's had pressure, but not in the way that the United States would have wanted. And so, again, for the U.S. and for U.S. policy, the question becomes, what can the U.S. do to alleviate the ongoing humanitarian crisis? Feliciano has had incredible thoughtfulness on this issue. I've had the opportunity to work with him various times throughout the years, and he's always incredibly thoughtful in terms of how he frames the crisis itself. And so the U.S. has to think about how it can alleviate that pressure on one end, regain influence on the ground, counter our geopolitical rivals, and then aid in, of course, restoring democratic governance and help lay the groundwork for a prosperous, future for Venezuelan people. And I think really fundamentally off the front, the U.S. has to look at this as not sort of an immediate transaction. And I think that's part of the challenge. They're looking for an immediate transaction, and it may be longer or more enduring in terms of thoughtfulness and strategy applied to sort of get Venezuela, back to, the democratic rules of the game. And again, pathwaying for a prosperous future, for Venezuelan people. And again, as we said, the U.S. sanctions they've undeniably placed economic pressure on Venezuela, but the pressure again has pushed Maduro to rely on international allies who, by the way, who have served as intermediaries in extracting and trading Venezuelan oil, for example. So you sanction the oil sector. And again, I agree with both Feliciano and Chris. We have to disaggregate sectoral sanctions from targeted sanctions. That's critical. And most people don't do that. They sort of lump them all together. And I think it's critical that we do that. But what it's done is it's countries that have long histories in circumventing sanctions. Cuba, right? Long histories they've become essentially sort of mentors to Venezuela. And it was tragic because the United States announced that it was going to levy sectoral sanctions almost a year before it actually did. So it gave Venezuela almost a year to figure out how to embrace for impact. And so far, again, by virtue of not displacing the regime, it's clear that the Venezuelan regime, picked it up off, fairly quickly. So, given the reality, I think we got to reevaluate sanctions. I think first we should consider shifting away from broad sanctions that don't have a whole lot of teeth to begin with, in which Venezuelan allies have enabled them to circumvent. And I think we could double down on targeted sanctions against individuals that are responsible for human rights abuses, corruption. We're doing that now. I think that's probably something we can do more of. In indictments on Green, for example, has recently come out. I mean, things like that I think could be, continue to be meaningful. But keep in mind, sanctions in and of itself is an awful instrument of power. In other words, it doesn't have effect without a broad range of other policy initiatives that are meant to complement the pressure that sanctions could impose. And those are oftentimes off-ramps, right? So you levy sanctions as a means of putting pressure, but you've got to have some type of exit or off-ramp for the regime that's acceptable. And I don't think we've gotten there. But I think, the regimes, the sanctions rather, so again, disaggregating sectoral from targeted, I think they have to be, more effective at closing off the regime's avenues of survival. And that may be looking at the connective tissue that the regime has with other like-minded countries and sort of thinking through that, more meaningfully. I mean, if Venezuela, for example, continues to benefit from illicit markets and external support from the countries I've mentioned, change is going to continue to remain elusive in Venezuela. And so we got to focus not only on sanctions, but also on pressuring allies to stop, exploiting Venezuela for their own political, and economic gain. India may be an example of that as an ally that has benefited in the past, and it's been, sort of back and forth, but in the past from, some of the pressure we placed in terms of sectoral sanctions. Third, and I'm sort of on the fence of this, but I definitely think it's a valuable conversation about rethinking about diplomatic re-engagement in some form, and not just purely backdoor, back channel stuff. I don't think that's got the kind of effectiveness that we want or allows us the kind of creative space to influence policy change. But we need to think that. And of course, reopening a formal embassy may not be, in the cards, but thinking about an interest section again, how do we double down on that rather? And at least give us a position where we can engage more directly. Third, I think we have to re-engage the American private sector. I think that's another critical step. And it's not just oil. I think that other sectors need to be engaged. Venezuela still holds, preference for American businesses, particularly over Russia, China, Iran. But I think you have to allow those American companies to operate with a long-term goal in mind of reasserting American economic influence on the ground, right? Not just sort of short-term allowing Americans in. Of course, then you got to close off those avenues that sustain the economic needs of the regime to dig in. But certainly giving the American private sector another shot at growing influence over the time is something that we should think about. Allowing American companies to operate in specific sectors. We've heard the discussion around oil for food or medicine initiatives, which may on one end alleviate the humanitarian crisis, while on the other end allowing the American private sector back in. And then finally, I think we got to continue to double down on the partners that we have in Guyana, Colombia, Peru, Brazil. I found sort of the post-July 28th environment really interesting at how sort of leftist regimes in the region were navigating this in a very carefully calibrated manner. On one end, they didn't want to undermine the Latin American left by now aligning with a clear dictatorship, right? It is no longer playing by the rules of the democratic game, while also not being openly confrontational. So we put them in a really peculiar position. And I think we need to continue to sort of double down on the regional relations that we have that could be important and powerful sources of change in Venezuela as well. I can go on, but I'll stop there. Hopefully that was thoughtful.
Thank you. Thank you. No, that's really helpful. And I think it really sets the stage for my next question to Asdrúbal. And you talk about the private sector. So this is in the line of Asdrúbal. What do you think about the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation? How do they view the role of sanctions in achieving political change, particularly in cases where economic or social stability is at stake? So how do you see it?
Sí, es un punto importante porque efectivamente, en primer lugar, el sector privado venezolano ha aumentado su peso en los últimos años, dado el colapso del Estado. No podemos olvidar que más allá de esta discusión de las sanciones, la economía venezolana perdió 80% de su tamaño. El Estado venezolano pasó de tener un gasto público en torno a 50 puntos del PIB a estar en este momento en torno a 17 puntos del PIB, y eso es principalmente perjudica lo que es la provisión de educación y salud para las mayorías. Muchas veces fuera no hay una comprensión clara de los efectos de las sanciones sobre el sector privado. Recordemos que Venezuela prácticamente está excluida del sistema SWIFT, con lo cual pagar o realizar transferencias entre venezolanos y el exterior está bastante limitado. No es que es imposible, pero tiene limitaciones, porque si bien las sanciones están dirigidas al gobierno o entes del gobierno, termina habiendo un efecto colateral sobre actores privados y particulares. O sea, es harto conocido, en mi trabajo en consultoría lo veo en el día a día, problemas ligados a corresponsalías de bancos, cierres de cuenta, proveedores que no quieren trabajar con Venezuela, empresas internacionales, muchas de ellas ligadas a tecnología. El caso más emblemático es Oracle, que no trabaja con empresas venezolanas, y muchas otras. Entonces, eso lo que está generando y lo que nosotros hemos visto es una presión en los costos que son incluso más altos para operar en Venezuela. Muchas empresas en Venezuela, para mantener su operación, dependen de intermediarios, han tenido que cambiar proveedores, y esto, por supuesto, repercute también en el costo de sus bienes. Por eso en Venezuela también el costo de vida es elevado. Es un factor, no es el único, pero el estar sancionado genera pues un aumento en nuestro costo de vida. Para los que no lo saben, Venezuela es una economía bimonetaria, es decir, es una economía que tiene una dolarización informal, circulan bolívares, que es nuestra moneda, y dólares. De hecho, en zonas fronterizas también el peso colombiano, pero fuertemente bolívares y dólares. Nosotros en dólares tenemos niveles de inflación calculados por nosotros cercanos al 14% en un año. Y un factor que se incluye allí es justamente todas estas ineficiencias que provocan las trabas internacionales para hacer negocios. Los bancos tienen limitaciones para realizar transferencias hacia el exterior. Las empresas venezolanas tienen limitaciones para endeudarse en el exterior. Nosotros no tenemos capacidad de entrar en una negociación, esto me parece súper pertinente. El Fondo Monetario Internacional y el Banco Mundial no reconocen al gobierno de Maduro, y aunque no hay sanción, ese no reconocimiento impide apoyo técnico de estos organismos, impide poder accesar a programas que pudieran ayudar en términos de políticas públicas y que pudieran ayudar a la gente. Entonces, hay una cantidad de elementos adicionales allí que, insisto, el gobierno tiene capacidad de resistir porque, bueno, opera con sus aliados, opera a través de una economía paralela, y por lo tanto los efectos más fuertes de las sanciones los sufre el sector privado y los ciudadanos. Los ciudadanos en parte porque pagan productos más caros, porque para poder viajar fuera del país son los pasajes más costosos del planeta, porque hay limitaciones para temas de aerolínea. Entonces hay una cantidad de consecuencias que muchas veces no se están midiendo del efecto de las sanciones en el día a día. Creo que en línea con con lo que señalaba Brian, hay que recalibrar y pensar este esquema, ¿no? Yo sí creo que es muy importante diseñar mecanismos que a lo mejor apunten más hacia esta economía ilícita, hacia estos flujos alternativos, que hacia las actividades medulares que sostienen el Estado venezolano, como es la actividad principalmente petrolera, que es de donde salen los recursos que sostienen la economía y que sostienen sobre todo a población muy vulnerable que sigue teniendo una dependencia muy marcada del Estado venezolano.
Muchas gracias, excelente y muy interesantes tus remarks y tus comentarios. Christopher, please jump in.
So yes, I agree entirely with Asdrúbal. So I think there are two issues here that really merit attention. The first is the issue which both Brian and Asdrúbal have mentioned, which is the impact of sanctions in consolidating not just a criminal regime in that country, but criminal networks, Iran, Turkey, Russia. I mean, for example, secondary sanctions on the trading of debt in the case of Venezuela that were imposed in 2019 led to the consolidation of Russia's control of that debt. Let me just pause on that for a second. So here we have a moment where you have, I think it's $130 billion worth of debt that Venezuela is now in default of. You're going to get Russian, Chinese, and other rather shady characters around the table negotiating that debt when the time comes. That is not just a short-term problem, it's a huge long-term problem. The second to that point is we're beginning to see overall the challenge of, if you will, sort of the disengagement of the West and the US. Even allies, supposed allies like Lula and others are talking about de-dollarization, the disengagement from SWIFT, the hegemony of the dollar and the beginning to chafe under that. What does that mean in terms of not just the US dollar? I'm not here to defend the US dollar, but the overall notion of a Western created, managed system of financial exchange, of Western norms and what have you. The alternative is really unclear. And the truth is that if you were to take all of these sanctioned countries, put them into one giant summit, you'd have about 20% of the global economy. That will eventually come to hurt the United States and the European Union, other, let's say, sort of sanctioning countries that are clearly embedded on this. And last, to the point, and I want to hear Feliciano's recommendations and thoughts on this, is the issue of sanctions having an effect on humanitarian support, but also in terms of the international perceptions of humanitarian support. And Feliciano, I hate to put you on the spot, but to what extent do US sanctions hurt not just the actual implementation and delivery of humanitarian support? Because they always, you talk to US policymakers, they'll say, well, you know, there are carve-outs. To what extent does that hurt, in fact, the interest of other countries to contribute to humanitarian assistance because of US sanctions, which could be, which could be difficult. There we go.
Thank you. And you're giving me the prompt for my next question,
Good.
Christopher. And I'd like to start with Feliciano and then hear from all. Actually, I want to move forward with a very broad question that tries to tackle this impact on human rights and humanitarian access, right? So I'd like to ask Feliciano and all how these sanctions can be structured if reimposed to prioritize the protection of human rights while minimizing humanitarian impact. And do we have any practical measures that should be included to safeguard humanitarian aid access? So yeah, I understand this is a broad question, but if you can, if definitely we have to address the humanitarian issue and humanitarian aid and the attack on human rights, especially after what happened after the recent election.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thanks, Chris, for setting this up also regarding, what to do and impact on rights. It is true that we're facing very, very serious situations of violations of rights that have to do with these arbitrary arrests and other areas in terms of political and civil rights. But there are ways to deal with those, basically in terms of the scrutiny and, say, a robust system of scrutiny on the issues that have to do with these rights. For example, the recent approval of the renewal of the mandate of the Office of the High Commissioner and the International Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela. It was the process of advocacy for having such a robust mandated system of scrutiny, which then would allow, hopefully, for, in a sort of multi-track approach to the Venezuelan situation, in other areas, open up more possibilities, again, for finding means to navigate the political crisis while at the same time helping the Venezuelan people. I'll give you just a few basic numbers. We have right now our least amount of dollars requested for the humanitarian situation since 2019. It was a smaller program because we'd started late. But if we had thought of it as a year, then this would be the least amount requested, 617 million. We've gotten only so far at the end of October, so we only have November and December, 17% of the resources allocated. And this is unfortunately, to serve of the number of 7.6 million people in humanitarian need, in need of assistance, according to the UN system. This is only to reach, the goal is 5.1 million. That is less than 70% of those in need. But so far, end of September, only 40% have been reached. So not only we have the smallest amount of requested, with the least amount put into the country, 17%, as compared to 35, 37, and so on. But also we're not even reaching people in need. So this needs a different approach because social rights are also human rights. We had a talk with some people in Congress in the US. They said, but we're caring for human rights. Like, yeah, but you're speaking about, again, political and civil rights, key rights, of course, but social rights are also human rights. And Chris mentioned the migration situation, forced migration, which means that people suffer along the way as well. The worst violations of their rights with human trafficking, with exploitation, and so on. Another situation that to me, and I was just looking at it now before we started, perhaps the reason why we're getting much less than in other years of the financing, when one looks at the 24 humanitarian programs in the world, of the 24 programs as expressed by the financial tracking system of the UN humanitarian coordination. Well, Venezuela is the one that got the least amount of the 24, the least amount. And if one looks also at how large or not is the amount requested, Venezuela again being among the worst crises with the largest migration crisis, it's still in number 17 of the funding requested. If one looks at the countries below Venezuela needing or at least having a humanitarian response plan, not one of them is in the situation in which Venezuela is right now. And this is also, to me, at times, it's kind of, I wonder, why is it that so little is put into Venezuela? And I think it does have to do with this situation of uncertainty. Should we put more money? Would this affect the political sort of the political tract of the situation, right? And I think that unfortunately, again, our social situation has been caught up in the political negotiations, in the political conflict, and there must be a way in which we can, knowing, of course, the complexities of the political conflict, but we should be able to separate, at least in some ways, what has to deal with the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. I am extremely concerned because also in regards to independent organizations, civil society organizations, we have seen many donors leave. And even, and I'll say this, in our own work as Acción Solidaria, 3 have left suddenly just this year. Those who were sort of putting funding in programs that would, care for people. So it is a very concerning situation. And my sense, and it would have to be proven somehow, but my sense is that really the dealing with the political conflict is in general sort of jumping into the possibilities of helping out a population in need. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Feliciano. Chris?
Well, Feliciano in the last statement answered my question, but I want to make it more pointed, and I appreciate Feliciano's diplomacy here. Having worked on Cuba for a long time, in which I defend Cuban human rights, regime change, the need for a broader policy that promotes political transition in Cuba, I'm always struck by how much that conversation is clouded by the issue of the embargo. I would talk to, and we can argue about the hypocrisy of human rights groups. So we'll say like, well, we are concerned about human rights abuses in Colombia, but on Cuba, it comes down to the embargo. And I think that's odious, quite frankly. But it does represent a huge stumbling block when it comes to addressing issues of humanitarian support, of proper engagement on these issues. And so if I can ask both Asdrúbal, I know I'm not here as a chair, and I'm sorry, Gabriela, as well as Feliciano, can you elaborate a little bit more on the extent to which you think U.S. sanctions basically undermine a global push for humanitarian support and in a more rational exchange on what's going on in Venezuela, Cuba being one, but let's focus on Venezuela.
Asdrúbal?
Sí. Bueno, es que el tema, digamos, es bien complejo, porque además en Venezuela, un poco para medir los impactos que esto puede tener hacia futuro, un mantenimiento del tema sanciones. Hay varias áreas donde tú tendrías que evaluarlo, ¿no? Una de ellas, obviamente, tiene que ver con impactos para los más directos, la afectación de la actividad petrolera, en impactos en importación de alimentos y medicinas. Es un área crítica. Hoy por hoy, este año, para importación de alimentos y medicinas, se han destinado más de $5.000 millones, de los cuales han venido principalmente de la actividad petrolera formal de ventas de divisas que vienen de empresas como Chevron, Rexol, Moreland Pro. Entonces, si tú impulsas sanciones y restringes este tipo de actividades, no voy a decir que van a desaparecer las importaciones de alimentos y medicinas, pero entran en un esquema mucho más discrecional, con mucho menos control, sobre los cuales obviamente creo que puede haber efectos negativos sobre población vulnerable. Luego tienes afectaciones importantes en servicios públicos. Es harto conocido los problemas de electricidad que tiene Venezuela. Por supuesto que no estamos eludiendo la responsabilidad del gobierno de Maduro y del chavismo en general en esto, pero también es conocido que es difícil que el gobierno pueda trabajar con proveedores confiables en corregir problemática eléctrica, Siemens, General Electric, si no hay una revisión del tema sanciones. Y la verdad, cada vez es peor la debilidad estructural que tiene el sistema eléctrico venezolano. Entonces también yo hago aquí un llamado, creo que es importante la revisión de sanciones que estén afectando esta dinámica del movimiento de los pagos. Aquí pudiera diseñarse mecanismos donde buena parte de la venta de crudo pueda ser destinada, bien sea a áreas humanitarias como las que ha descrito muy bien Feliciano, que son críticas, pero también, por ejemplo, recursos que vayan directamente a la solución del problema eléctrico. Mientras las sanciones se mantengan tal y como está, difícilmente podremos obtener una solución del problema eléctrico, porque hay, bueno, contratistas muy específicos, no es difícil conseguir sustitutos, ni siquiera en los países aliados que trabajan de la mano con Maduro, y por lo tanto eso tiene un efecto muy fuerte sobre la dinámica de la población. Pero en líneas generales, creo que si Venezuela sigue, y esto ya es un comentario más general que incluso trasciende la sanción, si Venezuela sigue en este ciclo político donde no tenemos la posibilidad de alcanzar acuerdos, donde no tenemos la posibilidad de tener un gobierno reconocido, la capacidad de crecer, de recuperar lo que hemos perdido es extremadamente limitada. Y yo sí creo que la discusión sobre el tema sanciones tiene que darse sobre este debate general, cómo construir un mecanismo que Venezuela obtenga solución a su problema político, se normalice y nuevamente se inserte en la comunidad internacional y se pueda construir un plan de estabilización con apoyo de países claves, con apoyo de organismos multilaterales que permitan recuperar la senda de crecimiento y que permita resolver el grave problema humanitario y sobre todo de población vulnerable. Esa es una discusión muy importante. Es verdad que Venezuela ha crecido en estos últimos trimestres, que se ha reducido la inflación, pero es insuficiente para garantizar que la mayoría de la población esté en mejores condiciones. Y si nosotros se siguen manteniendo estas sanciones y si seguimos con un gobierno que no tiene reconocimiento, lamentablemente eso va a continuar, con gravísimos problemas de servicios públicos, con un sector petrolero incapaz de aumentar su producción por encima del 1.000.000 de barriles diarios y con un Estado incapaz de proveer bienes y servicios públicos de calidad. Entonces, lo que nos enfrentamos en los próximos meses, en un escenario asumamos el escenario de imposición de nuevas sanciones, es un mayor deterioro económico, con un gobierno que va a buscar mecanismos para resistir esto y fortalecer la economía paralela, la economía ilícita, pero con una población vulnerable que va a recibir los mayores efectos y con un sector privado ya bastante debilitado que va a tener que seguir asumiendo sobrecostos.
Gracias, gracias, Asdrúbal. I'd like to move forward now, asking Brian and Chris particularly, in light of this, you know, everything that has been mentioned in this discussion, and talking about this risk for geopolitical escalation. How might reimposing sanctions affect Venezuela's alliances with countries like Russia, China, and Iran? You mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar. And could these ties undermine the sanctions' intended outcomes and potentially escalate regional tensions? So, Brian, do you want to take it from here? You're muted.
Sorry, you would have thought we would have learned since 2020 about the whole. Hey, Chris, did you want to take that first? Do you want me to jump in? I think I've said some few things on this already, but I can.
I'll take it first and take the load off your shoulders, and so you can learn how to unmute yourself in the meantime. So look, I think we are risking right now a very fragmented geopolitical system, in part because of sanctions. Again, if you look at the alliance of the sanctioned countries, many of them just met in Russia at the Kazan BRICS summit, and they are arguing for the de-dollarization of the international global economy. They're arguing for the creation of electronic transfers that would remove them from the United States or the Western oversight. This is very troubling. It's not troubling even in the specifics of that, but if you imagine that a UN Security Council, which has Russia and China that have veto rights, we may be very well looking at the end of multilateral sanctions. And we had multilateral sanctions on Iran, North Korea, with North Korea's contribution of its special security forces to Russia's war aims. That's not going to happen anymore. I mean, it is a very real risk of global fragmentation that is not just geopolitical, but it's also economic, and a very targeted effort to try to disengage from the Western liberal order. And while that may be understandable, its consequences are still unforeseen. And so, yes, sanctions are augmenting this idea of a global fragmentation. They are deeply distrusted by the global South. We hear even a supposed ally, President Lula of Brazil, not always an ally, but speaking against this. So we're really confronting a moment of an inflection moment of what do we do with sanction, and how do we avoid the consolidation of an axis of the sanctioned countries to undermine a global Western order. And while at the same moment, trying to preserve some element of international norms that sanctions were originally intended to defend against. Brian, I'll turn to you.
Chris, you said everything that I was going to say. It feels like, no, I'm not kidding. I agree with you entirely. I think that there's real pressure on, sort of the future international order. And I think that, again, I won't cite him directly, but several have said it, so I'm going to repeat it, which is the U.S. tends to use sanctions a lot like Cuban grandmothers use Vic Vapor Rub. We rub it on everything, thinking it's going to solve all the problems, and the reality is it doesn't have the kind of effect. It just happens to be a simple, easy, fairly.
May I just add, there are 36,000 sanctions right now in the world. 36,000. It's eye-watering. So yes,
and Chris, why is that?
Just like Vicks Vapor Rub, which is equally eye-watering. Sorry,
it's exactly right. But okay, why is that? It's because it's the easiest instrument to levy today in American foreign policy, right? It becomes fairly bipartisan. It becomes fairly easy to do. It demonstrates from a government, like an administration perspective, that you're doing something, that you're not sort of idle, right? It's more of the optics and political expediency that sanctions give you as a policymaker, rather than its ability to produce results from a foreign policy perspective or an outcome perspective. And I think that's part of the challenge. That's why there's so many sanctions out there, and virtually none of them have really succeeded in helping American foreign policy achieve its main objectives. And that's not to say that they're always sort of levied carelessly, but again, I think it's a fairly easy instrument to use where you can get the kind of support needed, and it tells the world that you're doing something. The problem is, again, I'm not sure it's having the impact. And American sanctions probably were more effective in the 90s and early 2000s when we were the only show in town. We're not the only show in town anymore. And as Chris points out, there's almost a sort of a bifurcation of the global economy, in which you have countries that have figured out through cryptocurrency and other means of avoiding U.S. financial institutions altogether, and those that sort of run heavy on sort of a Western U.S.-led financial network. And so I think that is continuing to produce some real issues, not just globally. And I'll take Chris's argument and I'll see that in Latin America as well, which I think is also fundamentally important, where the region stands at important crossroads. Now, the other thing I would mention, if we have an opportunity to talk about, I'll throw it out on the table now. The OES has really struggled to do anything here, largely because, again, the OES, and particularly the Democratic Charter, was largely, intended for dictatorships, countries that were not playing by the democratic rules of the game. And so the Democratic Charter has had a hard time historically at doing anything really meaningful in the Venezuela case because of the historical, the elections process, right? It sort of, even though it was contentious, it still meant that the country was operating, by even a facade of democracy. July 28th should be very clear, right? That we're not dealing with, even a rigged democracy. We're dealing with a dictatorship. And I wonder if that unlocks the instruments the OAS and the Democratic Charter have that it hasn't been able to unlock in the past. And that, again, also demands a real concerted effort to bring countries, particularly Caribbean countries, that want to have a vote at the table and aren't voting conscious, they're voting interest, which countries do, how we bring those countries together and align them towards, again, bringing a concert together to push for democracy, the restoration of democracy in the region. But I do think it has, and to go back to the question, what Chris said, fundamentally, not just in Venezuela, but the U.S. sanctions regime in general can continue to fracture and split, sort of international order in ways that, continues to reinforce this strategic competitive landscape.
Thank you both. And we are entering the last 10 minutes of this discussion. And thank you everyone who is sending us your questions for the Q&A section at 4:30. We are going to read those questions in a bit. So I'd like to start with the closing reflections, recommendations, and ask you, all of you, do you think there could be an alternative policy framework that can combine this kind of limited sanctions with strategic incentives? And how would this framework look like, particularly in the support of human rights and democracy? So how do you see this kind of new approach that could be taken as an alternative policy framework? Feliciano?
Well, okay, I'll throw a couple of things. One, it's a desire as a Venezuelan and living here that I'd really like to see Venezuela going to or back to formal markets. Vast corruption, grand corruption, as Amnesty International calls it, is at the root of many of the ills we're living today. In regards to social rights, in regards to, again, what Asdrúbal was mentioning, and basic infrastructure for services and so on. And if it were possible to think of the mechanisms to bring Venezuela back into those markets and to those spaces of countries aligned under a different type of systems of government, of doing business and the economy and so on, I think that would be extremely important for us as Venezuelans. And also to see resources coming into the country. I know it's going to take a while. Some of our studies on the ground tell us of, even as Asdrúbal was saying, that there have been improvements, but still in over 11,000 home surveys, we're seeing close to 20 million people, or 67% of the population, with depleted livelihoods, who have very little to live on, even if things continue to improve, but that improvement reaches them very slowly. So recognizing what the 28th of July meant and how difficult it's going to be for the Venezuelan government staying in power after the 10th of January to getting that recognition of legitimacy, we still need to see answers for the Venezuelan people. And once again, we have the mechanisms for, let's say, scrutiny on rights, and even in a possibility of maintaining engagement and not pushing towards entrenchment, then you can get conditions even for those impacts on political rights, on civil rights, hopefully to, be taken care of. I mean, there are close to 2,000 people arbitrarily arrested, and you have so many other areas as well close to that. So maybe, again, knowing that we will go into a new phase because of those results of the 28th of July, we still need Venezuela to take a different path for the Venezuelan people, for the improvement in their lives, to prevent more forced migration. And I think that this would require a much more multilateral approach. My concern also with the sanctions regime, the way in which it was put in place, I mean the general and sectorial sanctions, was that it brought us to just one other very powerful actor, and we could not avoid also being part of the internal politics. And even more, it would be even worse, again, if sanctions were turned into legislation. But hopefully a much more multilateral approach, and taking into consideration, keeping on the table the millions of people affected by whatever decisions are taken, I think it would hopefully lead to much more creative ways to find solutions for Venezuela out of the political conflict, which will not be a short-term process, but hopefully would mean bringing more answers to the needs of Venezuelans today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Feliciano. How do you see it, Asdrúbal?
Bueno, yo pienso que un poco el régimen de sanciones tiene que modificarse y debe ir hacia elementos que no afecten tanto el flujo de ingresos, por todo lo que Feliciano ha descrito muy bien, sino que afecte más bien los destinos de ese flujo y en aras de más transparencia. Entonces yo creo que lo que se puede buscar son mecanismos donde el uso de los recursos se limite su discrecionalidad, se asignen a áreas de vulnerabilidad importante en Venezuela, como los temas humanitarios, los temas de servicios públicos, los temas de infraestructura, de apoyo al sector privado, que son áreas críticas que necesitan recursos, que merecen atención y que por lo tanto podemos bajar la discrecionalidad con que el gobierno maneja los recursos. El reciente esquema de sanciones de licencias individuales que ha otorgado el gobierno de los Estados Unidos es mejorable, apunta en esa dirección, pero es mejorable. Esas licencias se han otorgado a empresas, permiten la gestión de campos petroleros, permiten que el flujo petrolero siga ocurriendo, pero hay limitaciones para que el gobierno de Maduro maneje directamente esos recursos, y esos recursos digamos hoy, se destinan en este caso al mercado cambiario, que financian importaciones que son vitales para sectores clave como alimento y salud. Entonces, ese tipo de esquema pueden ser mejorables. Lo otro que también es clave es indagar aún más en todo el esquema alternativo, en mecanismos de criptomonedas, de usos de intermediarios, de toda esta economía ilícita que tú puedes allí no se está sancionando esa dinámica, y creo que también es importante profundizar en el conocimiento de estos mecanismos para aplicar correctivos que incidan en esa actividad que efectivamente sí es lo que está alimentando ingresos importantes de grupos de poder internos y externos que sostienen al gobierno. Entonces creo que hay que pensar un poco más en el tema de estrategia. No voy a ser tan tajante en señalar hay que eliminar las sanciones, sino que creo que tiene que haber un rediseño de estas justamente para reducir estos efectos que, bueno, aquí han descrito muy bien, tanto Christopher como Feliciano, y de alguna manera afectar todo ese mecanismo alternativo que le ha permitido a Maduro sostenerse. Y lo otro es también entender la realidad geopolítica en línea con lo que señalaba Brian. Es muy importante el rol que juega China, Rusia, Irán, Turquía, algunos países árabes, y entender que si Estados Unidos aísla más a Venezuela y no establece algunos mecanismos, digamos, alternativos, lo que termina ocurriendo es que alejamos más al país del hemisferio occidental y lo acercamos más a estos círculos de influencia, y creo que eso también es importante.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I'd like to wrap up this roundtable conversation and discussion with a question that really looks at future scenarios and potential risk implications. So to all of you, what potential scenarios might unfold if sanctions, when sanctions are reimposed in terms of political reform or backlash within Venezuela, and what are the main risks and opportunities for the international community to consider? Do you want to take this question, Chris?
I will, Gabriela. Thank you. It's on the other side of the Atlantic, so it's currently almost 8:30 here. So if I'm a little bit disengaged. So look, I'll say it point blank, and then I need to check out. The first is, if you reimpose these sanctions, and there's clearly a hue and cry for for the US to reimpose them. The first is that you will basically, and everyone has said this, you will turn the keys back over to Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, all of the broader countries that are engaged in combating Western influence. This is a broader geopolitical issue. This is not the Cuba sanctions of, say, the 1990s. This is a series of sanctions that really risk creating an axis, not just of evil, but of the sanctioned. The second issue is that you then, over the long term, then turn over those keys to actors that will not have a profound interest in a democratic, stable Venezuela. And I quite frankly fear we risk a failed state in Venezuela as a result, in part, of the failed economic policies, but in part because of the sanctions, but with stakeholders that have no interest in a democratic reconstruction of Venezuela. And that is very risky. And last, this is all about leverage. We can argue that, returning sanctions on Chevron should happen because the Maduro government has failed miserably in meeting any of the minimal requirements of a free and fair election and any sort of democratic transition. But what are the long-term consequences of reimposing sanctions that would remove Chevron and other Western companies? And that's unclear. So I think we need to avoid the temptation out of anger, out of virtue signaling, to simply return sanctions because they make us feel good. And we need to consider the long-term consequences, humanitarian-wise, and in terms of long-term investment. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Gabriela.
Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, just to add, I think Chris put it incredibly well. I mean, the sort of broader geopolitical consequences. The other thing I question is whether or not the reimposition of sanctions is going to immediately start to chip away at some seeming unity of the opposition, right? I mean, that's part of the challenge I think is really important, is that coming off of the 28th of July, there was obviously an incredible sort of unifying among opposition, and sanctions have historically sort of impeded that unifying opposition. I wonder if the reimposition of sanctions is going to undermine, not strengthen, but undermine the opposition in Venezuela. And those are questions for Feliciano and Asdrúbal, but I think that historically they chipped away at some of the unity among opposition. That's also what's undermined the sort of efficacy of sanctions overall, is sort of challenges of opposition unity. But anyway, in addition to what Chris said, I would just throw that out there, that may be another interesting element to consider.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to move on with the Q&A. I know that, Eduardo, we are past 2 minutes from 4:30, so I move quickly to read the questions that we have for our speakers today. The first one is for Asdrúbal and Feliciano from Adriana. She says, muchas gracias por sus puntos de vista. Ciertamente el gobierno ha creado recursos alternativos con la ayuda de Rusia, China, etcétera, haciendo el gobierno más fuerte. Lejos de seguir implementando las mismas sanciones que Estados Unidos ha implementado, ¿no debería el gobierno de Estados Unidos modificar a quiénes y qué sectores sanciona? ¿Qué sentido tiene seguir sancionando directamente a individuos del régimen cuando el gobierno puede seguir usando terceras personas y compañías para sobrevivir en el poder? Las sanciones han servido más como un recurso para el mismo gobierno para negociar la liberación de americanos y otros presos en Venezuela que en presionar al gobierno para que cambie. So I open it for discussion for Asdrúbal and Feliciano.
Bueno, yo comparto en parte la opinión y solo digo ratificar lo que dije antes. Creo que sí hay que redefinir y replantearse el esquema sancionatorio porque no ha dado resultados.
Feliciano, gracias, Asdrúbal.
No, same here. And I would go as far even to say that I'd like to see sanctions, general sanctions and sectorial, lifted. And not lifted perhaps without, of course, some conversations on issues that are as well key. For example, again, freedom for the arbitrarily arrested, perhaps a National Electoral Council that changes so that elections for 2025 for the National Assembly and local and regional governments can take place and not be affected by what happened on the 28th of July and so on. But I think that we do need a different mindset to move forward again, because, and I am afraid of that as well, being here and what we're seeing with legislation, for example, on civil society organizations, is that we take more sort of the Nicaraguan path instead of one in which we move towards an opening of the space.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Feliciano. I'm going to read the next question. It's from Dulce Suarez. It's to everyone and Dr. Gamarra. Sanctions, while intended to isolate, can paradoxically strengthen relations between targeted countries, enabling them to develop robust networks for mutual support. Recognizing and addressing these unintended consequences is essential to refine sanctions as an effective tool of international policy. Therefore, following what you ask, Dr. Gamarra, what should the next president learn from the past and end those mutual support networks?
Well, you know, I had the privilege today of just having to introduce you all, and I thoroughly enjoyed the very, very interesting discussion. So I don't want to poner la cuchara in what has already been a very high quality discussion. I'm going to ask the panelists to respond, but I will invite Dulce and the rest of you because the next panel on November the 20th is exactly about that question. So thank you.
Thank you.
I will just say quickly, in response to Eduardo's comments, this is a long-term discussion. This is not just about Venezuela. It's not just about Cuba. It's not even just about Russia. I do think we need, and I applaud FIU and thank you for the invitation, Eduardo, Brian, everyone else, to have this discussion, because this is about the future of geopolitics. It is about, if you imagine this, we're on the cusp of the discussion over containment, the discussion over a Cold War, but it's different because it's about geopolitical fragmentation. And so I want to applaud everyone for having this discussion. It's not going to be easy, and I hope we continue it. I hope I'm invited back to continue that discussion. So thank you, Eduardo, because it's not an easy answer. This is not an up or down binary discussion. It is about how do we nuance and understand and better implement sanctions so as not to weaken the influence of the West over the future direction of human rights and democratic norms globally.
Thank you. And the last question that we have is for Brian. It comes from Martin Brown, and he asks, how have the strategic investments and support from foreign powers such as China, Iran, and Russia contributed to the Maduro regime's resilience against domestic opposition and potential regime change in Venezuela? Additionally, in what ways do these foreign investments reshape the geopolitical landscape of Latin America, particularly concerning U.S. interest and regional stability?
Thanks for that. And thanks, Martin. That was an incredible question. It's akin to the incredible questions that he asked in class. I will tell you, Martin is one of my former students, and he asked incredibly thoughtful questions in class too. Martin, good question. I think we covered some of that too, just sort of suggesting, and I know you posted the question earlier, but just the importance that Iran, China, Russia have had, Cuba have had in helping Venezuela circumvent sanctions by providing, again, whether it's oil swap deals, other provisions of economic subsistence and exchange. I think they've really helped diminish the power that sanctions have as an economic instrument, right? And it's not just that; they've also given them, some degree of relevance in the international system as well by bringing a sort of a group of countries together that are swimming in a direction that's consistent, certainly one that's consistently away from the United States. The second question I also think is really interesting because this raises questions about, if you go back in sort of the contemporary history of Venezuela as an activist power in the region, right, leveraging oil as a means of wielding influence. That's no different than it is today. Just the sort of economic circumstances is slightly different. But if you look at, for example, the Caribbean, why does the Caribbean abstain from really important votes in which they know, where the sort of moral justice lies, but they don't vote in that direction because of the economic interest, and it's often tied to, the provisions and benefits they get from Venezuela that extends back to Petrocaribe, et cetera. But also during the Chavez years, a heightened sense of activism. You think about Iran's presence in the region post-Chavez. Chavez had a lot to do with sort of opening some of those pathways up for the Iranian regime to sort of make its entry back into the region. The same can be said with Venezuela and Russia, in which they have become spaces in which it's invited those historically contentious rivals back into the Western Hemisphere in ways that I think undermine not just the interests of the United States, but the democratic interests of the region and the security of the region. And so I think, that I'll give you another anecdote. I once had a colleague, I won't name him, but he said to me, the challenge that we've had in Washington is that politicians view Venezuela a lot like they viewed Cuba, which is a Caribbean island that it doesn't matter if we get policy right or wrong, right? The consequences are very limited. And he was he had an authority. I mean, he was an authority in the space. And I thought about that for a while, and it sort of hit me that he was probably incredibly off, because it was Cuba that promoted incredible violence and resistance across the Americas that led to, violent conflict during much of the Cold Wars, as the Soviet Union tried to reach into the region and sort of provoke instability in ways that undermine Western influence. And so I see that as also being, part of, what we should be thinking about in terms of the way these foreign investments that ultimately make their way into the region have from a geopolitical and security perspective. And so it's a great question. I probably didn't give you a very satisfying answer, but I certainly think that it does invite those countries into the region in ways that undermine the interests of the region as a whole.
Thank you, Brian. And before I turn it to Dr. Gamarra again for the closing remarks, I'd like to thank all the speakers for this wonderful panel. It's been my pleasure to serve as the moderator. So thank you again for this opportunity. Eduardo?
Bueno, thank you all as well. I want to thank Chris for staying up this late. I know it's a little bit past your bedtime, and but thank you so much, and we will invite you again. Asdrúbal, muchísimas gracias por tu participación. Ha sido verdaderamente muy interesante lo que has planteado esta tarde, y nos va a servir mucho para pensar mucho sobre este tema. Pero quiero decirles que my very special thanks go to Feliciano, who has always been helpful to us, and I want to thank you for really coming in late in the game for this session, and your contributions, of course, were really spectacular as always. So thank you for joining us. Mil gracias, Feliciano. Ya estaremos en contacto contigo. I want to thank Brian, of course. Brian, very, very interesting, and I'm glad your battery lasted, and wonderful set of comments. Y Gabriela, you are a magnificent moderator, so thank you so much. It's always good to have a non-Venezuelan and non-gringo to be doing, I'm not sure about that Southern Cone accent there, but it worked, and thank you so much for moderating for us. So I invite you all, remember, November the 20th is our next seminar on basically what the new administration should expect, or what we should expect from the next administration about Venezuela. So thank you all, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Gracias.